Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Hemmings Hot Rod Barbecue Podcast. On this episode, I've got my producer. I've got Nick Cappetto on the show. Now, Nick does these shows with us all the time. He sees all the guests that we have on, and we got to talking, and Nick is a diehard car guy. And I was like, you know what? I think it's time that you come on the show. And one of the reasons that I wanted Nick to come on the show, because, well, he's younger than I am by quite a massive margin. But he also asks a ton of good questions. And we got started talking about restoration and started talking about if you do a full-blown restoration or if you're doing a mild restoration on the car. And as I have two cars that are under the knife right now, and Nick is a big guy that, likes to modify stuff, and he's got a couple of cars, figured it would be a good topic. So I wanted to touch on that. Nick, how you doing, man?
Good. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about what you got going on in your car life.
Yeah, dude, it's fun. It's interesting with both my Chargers. I have a 68 Charger, as you know, and my 69 Daytona replicas. They're both under the knives. And I started thinking about questions that I always ask, or that when I was kind of coming up in the hobby, what things that I didn't know that nobody ever told me, and that I kind of learned from just misstepping, right? Whether it was hiring the right shop or or hiring the wrong shop or the wrong mechanic, or trying to do stuff myself and not knowing things, or setting budgets that weren't, realistic, things like that.
Yeah. And that's something I always wonder about too, because obviously I'm on the younger side of the scale.
Mm-hmm.
And so budget's a little more of an issue for me. And I always see these, I do the same thing every car guy does. I scroll through Facebook Marketplace late at night, and that's where you get in trouble. I think I saw like a Dodge Dart this morning.
Right.
It was a piece of crap, but it was actually pretty cheap for what it was. And I was just thinking in my head, I'm like, how much money would it take to get to where I want it to be? And of course, nowadays it seems like everybody's buying these crate Hellcat motors and things like that and putting them in things. And I'm looking at you, but
Yeah.
just like I feel like there's always it's hard to figure out exactly what you should do to a restoration, because everybody has these huge budgets, either from like companies or just they come from money, and so they can put a ton of money into it. But really, like the everyday person, like what do you think the right avenue to go down a restoration is? Like, do you you go balls to the wall right away, or do you gradually do it? I know it's different for every person and financially, but what's your best take on that over your course of cars?
I think that one of the things, whenever anybody's getting into the hobby, right, I'm always a firm believer in buy the best of whatever it is you can afford. Okay. And then check your expectations, right? So if you always wanted, one, it has to do with budget. Okay. So if you've always wanted a 69 Camaro and you're like, I want this car really bad, but you have a budget of $5,000, the fact is you're not going to get one. Or if you get one, the thing is going to be a roach, and it's going to cost you $100,000 to get it back on the road and make it a beautiful car.
Yeah.
So I think expectations is one. Finances are another, right? So say if you mentioned a Dodge Dart, right? Say you found a 70 Dodge Dart and it's okay, right? Say it needs paint work, it needs interior work, but it runs and drives, but it also has a little bit of rust on it. Okay. That is a car that you can sink an enormous amount of money into, but you don't have really that much of a return. And I'm not saying anything bad against Darts because I'm a huge fan, but the fact of the matter is, if your buy-in is $5,000, say, or $8,000, well, mechanics still charge anywhere between $60 to $160 an hour, depending on where you live. Bodywork is the same way. Interior work from an upholstery person is still the same way. Now, if you're handy and you can do a lot of that work yourself, you can mitigate your cost. But the other thing is why are you buying it? What's your goal with the car? Right?
Yeah. I feel like we live in such a weird time right now, especially with YouTube really like picking. It's not really just now picking up, but it's always been gradually kind of getting there. But it seems as if like these YouTube channels are doing like restorations or building a vehicle, and it seems like it's nice when you have factory or like not factory support, but support from manufacturers, so you get parts or deals on it for advertising, things like that. But like, let's say I were to just jump in right now, not recording it or anything for YouTube, it's tough to even find parts right now. So yeah, you almost have to do the work yourself, because I know a lot of shops right now are months and months out. So
Hmm.
you got a car ready to go, you're looking at months before you can even get it in there, and then you got crazy shop charges right now just because like, oh, parts are hard to get and labor is expensive and things like that. So it's a daunting task for people that don't have an avenue to make money through the bill, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So it's an interesting time to want to restore a car, especially with like if you wanted to do like a muscle car.
Yeah,
Price is crazy right now,
it's
just
dude,
nuts.
it's really hard. And it's interesting. I mean, I'm as you are kind of, we're entrenched in this hobby. And
Yeah,
even to find when you're talking about muscle cars, you're still talking about, say it's a car from the 60s or the mid 70s. You're talking about cars that are 50 plus years old now. You're
yeah,
talking, which means you're talking about wiring that's 50 plus years old. You're talking about, a dozen or so set of hands that might have been through that vehicle in the last 50 years or so,
that's
right?
what's that's
And
what's really
that's scary because you
yeah,
have to go in, and if you're going to buy something, the fact is odds are it's not fully stock. And when I mean fully stock, I mean something that left the factory, right? I'm sure wires have been spliced in, I'm sure body work has been done, I'm sure mechanics have been done, I'm sure there's so many different things. One of the problems that we find that we run into now are the amount of qualified technicians and mechanics that can
yeah,
still work on older cars. And I know that sounds strange because you think, oh, it's an old car, it's a piece of cake. Try to find to get somebody now that really knows how to tune a carburetor. Okay.
yeah,
Right. Something like that. It sounds easy, but it's not. Um, Try to find a shop right now that will do body work, not insurance work, body work. Okay. Try to find a qualified painter, somebody that's been doing it, that really knows how to lay down paint and make it beautiful.
yeah,
These technicians are becoming harder and harder to find. And while a lot of the stuff, oh yeah, big money, a lot of money. While a lot of the stuff you can do yourself if you have the time and the patience,
yeah,
and you mentioned YouTube. YouTube is a great outlet because there are 1,000 videos on every topic to help you through. So you can generally do stuff. But the fact of the matter is, if you do not have the time, just just finding the individuals that can help guide you and or do the work on your vehicle is tough. Okay.
yeah,
um and I think one of the things you need to think about is, what are your goals with the vehicle? Is the vehicle going to be a driver? Is it going to be a road trip car? Is it going to be a hot rod? Is it going to be made for performance? Is it going to, do you want comfort in it? And I think these are questions that people, they fail to ask themselves when buying things, because listen, let's face it, when you're buying a fun toy, which these cars are,
yeah,
um, it's an emotional purchase. It's not a practical purchase,
yeah,
right? So
yeah.
that side of the brain doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, that's a tough. Yeah, you gotta make sure it's worth it. So
Got to make sure it's worth it.
you're doing a restoration right now, is that correct?
I've got, yeah. So my 68 Charger right now, like I said, it has been beat to death for the better part of 20 years. The wiring, it has, it had a custom dash in it that wasn't stock. The wiring was a complete hash, doesn't have any heat, no sound deadening, a lot of smoke and mirrors going on in that car, even though I've had it for almost, 20 years or so. The key for me, and one of the reasons that I hadn't done it prior, one was funds, very expensive to do it and do it right.
Yeah.
Two, the right individual. And I'm not talking about a shop. I'm talking about an individual that truly knows these cars inside and out. And for those listening out there, Mopars are kind of a black art. Mopars, you either know them or you don't. And the gentleman that I found is a gentleman in Southern California, and he doesn't want me to say his name because, well, he's got a lot of work on his plate and he's not taking new customers right now. But the fact of the matter is, he knows these cars left, right, and center. But I had to wait almost 3 years to get my car to him.
Oh my gosh.
Right. Um,
That's
but it will be done right. And it will last me the next 20 or 25 years. And that's what you want, or at least that's what I wanted. Now, I'm not saying there are other technicians out there that aren't qualified. There are, a lot of people out there. But again, it all comes down to time. It comes down to setting yourself a realistic budget, to setting yourself realistic goals on what you want the vehicle to do, and
yeah.
trying to avoid pitfalls.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting point you just said though. You know it's going to get done right, and that's what you're happy about. It's going to get done right, and that's
Mhm.
something I found that interesting. You said that because in my like car timeline, I'm kind of realizing now as I get older and my budget gets a little bit bigger
Mhm.
that doing it right the first time, even if it's double the price, is going to save you money in the long run. So I have a 2000, my daily driver is a Lexus SUV
Mhm.
that I've done a bunch of crap to and beat the heck out of, and we use it as a camera support vehicle for our
Sure.
training. And I started with like a cheap suspension, pretty much
Mhm.
broke that, and then I went to an expensive one, so I'm almost spending double
Right.
or even more in the long run. Especially, I mean, I save on labor because I do it all myself, but
Sure.
all the parts and stuff. If I would have just went straight into the expensive part or the OEM part, and like the my timing belt and water pump just went out, so I was like, I need to do OEM this time. I cannot mess around with that kind of stuff. And so it's an interesting realization when you come to that point and you go, I should have just done it right the first time, and your wallet hurts after it. So it's good that you got it to the right person, and yeah, I'm excited to see what it looks like when it's done.
Yeah, it should be good, but I think, let's put it this way. A lot of people, cars are hobbies, right? We do them, we sometimes we use them for business, but they're a hobby. And sometimes you can't afford the best stuff.
Yeah,
I mean, when you look at shocks, right? There are shocks that range everywhere from $18 a shocks to $600 a shock or more. So there are different levels of what people can afford. And it's not saying that, you know, if you can't do it right the first time, don't do it. You do what you can with the funds that you have. And I've done that for literally the most of my automotive career. I mean, I had never been able to really afford the best of the best. So I've gone with what I can afford, and you try to make it work. Where I would get burned was that I'm not a mechanic, right? I can do little things. I change brakes, take a drive shaft out, oil changes, change belts, garbage like that. Um, but when it comes to real like wiring and stuff like that, it's not my forte.
yeah,
Um, one of the things that I learned was that I never asked the questions. I never asked the right questions to the shops because I always felt as though they knew more than me. And for the most part, listen, they did. But I had a friend of mine once tell me, he's like, well, if you're going to go to a shop, you got to ask these questions. One, have you seen their work? Right. It's the same thing where, if you're going to get your house painted, or if you hire an interior designer, or if you're whatever you do, right. Or even if
yeah.
you go to a restaurant, I know that sounds like a stupid comparison,
Oh, I
but the
always
fact
recommend.
of the matter is,
Yeah,
right. You go and you look at reviews. So have you seen a shop? Have you seen their work? Have you seen an example of their wiring if it's a custom shop? Have you talked to people whom are customers of theirs? Have you gotten their opinions? Um, have you experienced one of their creations firsthand? Meaning, if it is a custom fab shop or something, can you find one of their existing customers and drive one of their vehicles? And did that shop give you good advice? Did they give you real estimates, or did they just jerk you around? And I have been on the bad end of that for so many different times. And over the years, you kind of learn. That's all.
yeah. Yeah, now a question that just came to my mind that I'm interested to ask you is, so you're restoring a Mopar right now, and I know you're a Mopar guy through and through. Do you ever wish that you were building something different that you could put an LS platform in it? Because
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
assuming that Mopar is more expensive to rebuild or build than, I mean, having like a 440 or whatever you got in
Mhm.
the Cuda, it's probably going to be more expensive to rebuild that and find someone that knows how to work on those than someone that knows how to work on a Chevy LS. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah, I mean, my rule of thumb has always been this. If you're going to buy a Mopar and you plan to restore a Mopar, whatever your budget is, triple it, right? It's literally been my basically what I've lived by. And then it's pretty accurate as opposed to restoring a Chevy or a Ford. Now, I will say this, the best muscle car that I've ever had was not a Mopar. Best muscle car, best car, one of the best cars I've ever had was a 72 Monte Carlo that
Cool.
we built years ago and that subsequently got stolen. But that was a beautiful Monte Carlo with a stock interior. And we pulled out the original 350 because it was shot, and we put in a 383 stroker with Holley fuel injection and a
Yeah.
200 R4 with overdrive. and it was an absolutely fabulous car. It drove better than my Mopars. It looked amazing. So I like Mopars, but I gravitate to them. But I like everything. From a cost perspective, it's so much cheaper to build a Chevy because there are millions upon millions of them on the road. And there's a hell of a lot more aftermarket parts for Chevrolet and Ford than there is for Mopars. It's just the way it is.
Mopars are unique. Mopars are
They're yeah, they're unique, and that's why they're kind of rare. Like you generally don't see too many at a car show. But they're unique because they're rare, and they're also unique because I will be perfectly honest with you, they're not very good. And I know people out there are going to be like, "You son of a bitch." Listen, the fact of the matter is, Mopar made bomb-proof drivetrains, okay, and engines and rear ends. You know, Dana rear ends, 727s, 440s, 383s, 318s, slant sixes. These are all mechanical components that are just bulletproof. You know, you start to talk about body styles. Their body styles were completely different. They were kind of a little more edgy. You talk about Chargers and Cudas and things like that. They made things like the Little Red Express truck and stuff that was so outlandish.
Yeah.
But the build quality, stock, was straight garbage. And I don't care what anybody else says. Like, if you compare, like, I used at daily a 69 Pontiac Grand Prix. The build quality on that was leaps and bounds ahead of my 69 Charge. I mean, leaps and bounds beyond that. GM had their shit together. Every Mopar that I've ever had that was stock was built like it was built on a Friday at 5 o'clock after everybody had ingested a 12-pack. You know? And it's just kind of the way it was, you know?
Yeah, that's an interesting take on it. I never, obviously I've never had them side by side. I don't have as much experience with the older models that you do. So it's interesting to hear that. That's interesting. That's I know I'm beating a dead horse because everybody does LS swap, but I'm excited to see what a Mopar restoration looks like.
Well, an LS swap on anything is a great idea. Like, I don't have any problem with that. I mean, you know, people would get pissy about an LS swap, but you go, listen, this is 2022. Okay. This isn't 1982. It's a big difference. Yeah. I want, and I think most people nowadays want fuel injection. They want economy. They want, they want to be able to get in their vehicle, get 25 miles to the gallon and enjoy while still having the retro looks and that, but they also want obviously the better performance. Aftermarket, both OEM and traditional aftermarket, are catering to the enthusiast now that wants stuff done, that wants stuff that works, that isn't stock, right? When you go to car auctions, if you go to like Bring a Trailer or Hemmings or Meekum, the cars that bring the big money are the ones that are modified because they have air conditioning and fuel injection and new suspension and updated brakes, right? Stuff has moved on from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s.
I do want to say before anybody comes after me in the comments, I'm not comparing a 440 Mopar to an LS. I'm not putting them side by side. All I'm saying is it seems as if people just take whatever car they're restoring, and it's really easy. And everybody makes swap kits, and there's parts, like you said, parts that support the aftermarket scene. People just put LS in there, and it works. It just works. And so that's the only reason I'm saying that, and I'm not trying to compare the two. So do not.
No. Nick, I don't think anybody's gonna say that. I don't think anybody's gonna judge on that because, listen, the 440 in my Charger, that I'm never replacing. That's been a hell of an engine, and it's a big block 7.2 liter carbureted blunt instrument, and I adore it. And it makes power completely different than any small block that I've ever had. One is not better than the other. They're different. And LS, of course, will give you better fuel economy and stuff like that. But I think that they're different things for different styles of build. And that's another thing that I kind of want to touch on, right? When you're modifying or when you're building a car, we see tons of cars that go up for sale, whether it's on auction or in the classifieds or whatever. And people will say, I got $100,000 into this car. And then they wonder why they can't get 60,000 or 50,000 for the car.
Yeah.
When you customize a vehicle, okay, you're customizing it to your specific tastes. not the tastes of everybody else, right? If you are, and this goes back to, if you're doing a restoration or you're buying a car, what do you want it for? If you're doing it for yourself, fine, customize away, build what you want, but understand that your tastes are not necessarily the tastes of other people. So what you think is good, other people might view as really shitty. Whereby if you want a relatively stock car and you want to do tasteful mods to it that the majority of enthusiasts will look at and like, and you eventually plan on selling that car, you have to go down that road. And I think a lot of people kind of misjudge that, and then they wonder why they can never get any money back on a car they built or trying to sell,
Yeah, I do. I see that quite a bit too. Yeah, they almost need to make that. They need to pick the road they're going to go down before they even start anything, because why waste the money if you're just going to sell it? But obviously, some people fall into hard times and they got to sell things. And...
Oh, sure. But I mean, like, I'll give you a perfect example. Over the course of COVID, I bought 5 or 6 cars and sold a couple of cars and stuff like that. And there's a certain like aesthetic. Like a perfect example is my F-150. I bought a single cab short bed F-150 straight 6 manual. Okay. 95. Cool looking little truck, right? Yeah. When I bought it, it was kind of a hash. It was, it had mismatched wheels. The tires were all jacked up. It had some shitty running boards on it. But I looked at the truck and I was like, you know what? This has the potential to be really cool. And so I started doing my due diligence. I went online. I looked at different comps of what trucks were selling for. And then I said, what can I do to customize it to make it really cool? One, clean it. I know that sounds ridiculous. People don't think customizing or cleaning when they think of customizing, but look at the cars that are for sale online and think how much better they'd be if you just waxed the goddamn thing. Yeah, if you shampooed the carpets, if you just put some elbow grease into the engine compartment, right? Boom. That does one thing. 2, it was a 2-wheel drive, but I did little things like I put a leveling kit on the front because it had a rake to it. And I evened it out the stance, and I put a little bit of a lift on it, put a little bit of bigger tire on it. So it looked like a 4x4. Put a nice stereo in it, but stuff that looked like it could have come from the factory that way, but that enhanced the overall look of the vehicle without pitching it over the top so that potential buyers would be like, oh my God. So I did a very, very light restoration on this thing without ostracizing the buying public. Yeah. And that's something that I think is very important. If it was my own personal truck and it's something that I wanted to keep, I probably would have done still stuff very, very similar, but I would have added like a roll cage with some old school Casey daylighters in the back and stuff like that. Right.
It's a very overlooked thing that just cleaning a car can add so much value. And I bought a 2000 Lexus LS 400 that had been sitting outside for 5 or 6 years. Got a crazy good deal on it. There was a small issue. I figured it out. And all I did in that car, now there was a hiccup in there and there was like a month or 2 delay. Sure. All I did was put new shocks on it. I fully paint corrected the outside, ceramic coated it, and then like shampooed the whole inside, cleaned everything, cleaned the vents, the door hinges, everything like that. I sold it for $4,800 about a month later. And so that's a crazy return, but all I really did was just make the car look more presentable.
But it's not a crazy return. It's you gave a shit, right? Yeah. And I think, and here's the other part. When you go to car shows, when I go to car shows, if it's a good guy show or whatever it is, I'll look at what people have done. I want to see what custom touches they've made to a car, and then I'll ask them questions as to why. Okay. And this goes from everything to brake kits, to wheels, to this, to that, to the other thing. A lot of it falls into, like, when I talk about things like brakes. Well, if you have a car that you're only putting 500 miles a year on, or 1,000 miles a year, why did you spend, $3,000 on 15-inch rotors and 6 piston calipers? Are you going to a racetrack? If you're not, it's kind of wasted money. Yeah. Right? If you're not taking it down your favorite back road at speed every weekend, why'd you do that? And again, it goes to, I think a lot of people, when they start to build, they'll go to the internet, obviously, and they will see what other people have done, and they'll say, okay, this is something that we've, this is something that I've seen and I have to have this level of performance and blah, blah, blah. The fact of the matter is a lot of cars are overbuilt. A lot of cars will never be used within an ounce of their performance that the people have put into them. The other thing is people are afraid to drive them because they've got so much money into these cars that they don't want to have anything happen to them, which kind of negates the purpose of building the damn thing in the first place.
Yeah, that kind of brings me back full circle to what I started talking about. It seems like all these restoration things you see online, people are just dumping 1,000. I mean, 1,000 horsepower is not a crazy thing. I mean, it's still pretty wild, 1,000 horsepower, but it's so achievable now. You can buy a crate motor from Dodge with 1,000 horsepower, which is just I mean, hard to get. But like, it seems so easy. And then you look at the price and you're like, oh, well, if I can't do that, why do it? And so it's kind of almost like there's such a high bar of, I don't even want to say restoration, but building of cars nowadays, because you can buy such a high horsepower motor or buy such crazy parts just at the click of a mouse.
Yeah.
And I feel like everybody thinks they need to achieve that, but in reality, 300 horsepower, 400 horsepower is plenty.
Dude, I mean, people, you know, again, this goes about, you know, what are your goals with it, right? If you want a nice driving car, just something that you can jump into and you can drive, just a nice little well-tuned small block is fantastic. A 250 horsepower small block, a 300 horsepower small block will do everything that you need. But I think everybody has gotten these numbers in their head. Well, it's got to be 500-600 horsepower. No, it doesn't. I mean, you know, there are cars that I've looked at with, you know, slant sixes in them or straight sixes, and they have been just as enjoyable in a very different way than stuff with the big horsepower motors. You know, you have to look at ease of maintenance. You have to look at really what your budget is, right? If you might have six-figure dreams, but you might have a McDonald's budget. And if that's the case, you could still do stuff with that. Yeah. But you have to set your expectations realistically, right? No, you're not buying $5,000 forged line wheels, right? You're buying wheels off of Summit for $60 for a steel wheel. You're not putting EFI in it. You got a 2-barrel on it, but you can tune it to make it run right. You're not going to get the best stereo with Apple CarPlay and 17 speakers and an amp. You're going to get something that sounds decent and that you will enjoy. Yeah. So again, it goes back to expectations and getting into the hobby at a reasonable rate. And I think so few people just don't do that, and they end up shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah. Have you heard of, I'm sure you have you heard of Donut Media on YouTube?
Of course. Yeah, sure.
They have a really good series on their YouTube channel called High Low. And they bought two identical 350Zs. They paid a little more for one because it's literally, they spend more money on one and then buy cheap parts for the other. And they're at the point now where they swapped in LS motors and they did big brakes and hydro e-brakes and transmissions and things like that. And it's so funny to see the price difference of these two things, yet the low car is more enjoyable for these guys to drive than the high car is, because you start throwing all these crazy parts of cars. You kind of have like this stigma. It should be leaps and bounds better than something that costs half the price, but that's usually not really the case in everyday use. You know what I mean?
You know, if you just break stuff down and you look at stuff on like a daily basis, one of the best cars that I have right now, and this isn't, well, it is an old car, I guess, when you think about it, is one of my daily drivers. It's my old Jeep Grand Cherokee. It's a 2002. It's 20 years old.
Yeah.
It is as stock comes. Straight six, makes 190 horsepower, right? I have seen these WJ Jeeps modded with lifts and this and that and the other thing and blah, 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 blah. And I've gone online and I started doing my research, because the fact is I saw people modding. I was like, oh, this would be a fun project. You know what? It's 100% stock and it's fantastic because all the parts are $9 from the auto parts store. I can fix it myself. I didn't go down that road of, hey, I'm going to put a lift on it and lose my fuel economy, or I'm going to put this stereo in and possibly hack up the wiring, or this or that. You can build a great vehicle for not a lot of money. You can. And you know, the interior doesn't have to be perfect. The paint doesn't have to be perfect. And I always say this, if you're going to make one thing perfect, make the mechanics of the vehicle perfect.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah,
Um,
I'd rather have a car that starts every time than a car that doesn't start every time and has a good paint job. So
yeah. And I mean, listen, paint and body, they will come, but if you don't have a car, like I've seen people spend, 30, 40 grand on a paint job and neglect the mechanics of the car. And that's great if you just want to stare at it and not move.
yeah,
But that doesn't make sense to me. So what I want to do is we've kind of rambled a little bit on this thing, and I think that's okay. But I made a list, and I just want to go down this list before we close out, right? And everybody out there, this is what I want you to take away. Okay. So if you're doing a restoration or a mild restoration, I'm going to throw these out at you. Ask this question: is it to an existing car, or are you doing it to a new one? Either way is totally fine. But in the back of your head, you have to ask yourself the question: are you doing it for yourself, or are you doing it for somebody else? If you're doing it for yourself and you never plan to sell the vehicle, customize, have fun, enjoy. If you're doing it for resale, don't go heavy on modifications. Keep it relatively stock because, again, your own particular taste may not be that of other people. Set your own set of goals with it. What are they? Is it a driver? Is it a road trip car? Is it a hot rod or a performance car? If it's a driver, something that you want to enjoy, a road trip car, put in your air conditioning, put in your comfortable seats. Do not put all the performance stuff on it that's going to ruin some reliability and perhaps make it too harsh on the street to drive if you go with that crazy suspension and brake setup, right? Um, if you're doing it a car that you already have, are you doing it as a sentimental car or a show car? Because those are two different things, right? If it's a sentimental car, you want the mechanics to be good so you could continue to enjoy it, and then you can get to body work and stuff like that later. If it's a show car that you don't plan on putting any miles on, understand that odds of you getting any investment back on that car that you put in are probably pretty low, right? It'll always have an inherent value, but odds are you're never going to recoup all the money that you have in that. So be cognizant of that. Um, Set a budget, set a reasonable budget, and stay true to it. If all of a sudden you tell yourself, well, I have 15,000 or 20,000 to put into a car, don't spend 15,000 on the car itself and then have 5,000 for modifications or maintenance and stuff like that. That's because you're never going to be able to do it. Get into a car at a decent price, and then figure out exactly where and what's the most important place to put those extra funds, and I think you'll be okay. Man, if you're customizing, try not to follow trends because trends go out of style. If you look at hot rods from like the pastel 30s and 40s and 50s cars from the 80s and 90s, man, those cars can be had. They were $100,000 builds and they're 25 grand right now.
so don't
And
put flames on the side. Is that what you're saying?
don't put flames on the side of the car. It's just, you know what I mean? It's like, I think you have to try to be tasteful in whatever it is that you build. And I always look at stuff and say, well, will other people like it as well? You can be as individualistic as you want, but I think there's also a point where I think, when I have people that see my cars, I want them to enjoy them as well, as much as I do from a visual perspective. So I try to keep that in the back of my head. So, keep that in mind when you're looking at shops. And this is another one. It is fine. It's like going to a doctor. Get second and third opinions. Do your due diligence on a shop, whether it's a mechanic or whether it's a body shop, a audio shop, or whatever the case is, right? Is this shop trustworthy? Have you asked other people? Have you seen their work? Right? You can go on and you can find people that have had work done. Ask to physically view stuff. Ask the shop for customers that they can refer to you. Hey man, listen, I'd like to get some work here. Do you have a customer cars that you've worked on? I'd like to see what you've done on that car. Okay. The shop shouldn't get upset. If they're a good shop and if they're reputable, they should be able to say, sure, yeah, this is a guy. Let me call that person and see if they wouldn't mind me giving you their number. You could see some of the work I've done. Body shops. Okay. Don't look at a car they just did. Try to find a car they did 10 years ago, 5 years ago. See how the paint has held up. See if there are bubbles under the bodywork. See if the owner is still happy with the quality of the product that they got and what they paid for and things like that. It's all about doing your due diligence when it comes to any type of restoration. Don't be hasty. Wait, find the right individual or individuals that are truly trustworthy that can work on your on your vehicle, you are going to pay for it. Good work is not cheap. I don't think anybody out there is under the misconception that good work is cheap. We live in a time where it is, you get what you pay for. Keep that in the back of your heads, right? Don't blow all your money on shoddy work, because then you're just going to have a shitmobile that nobody wants to see and you don't want to drive.
Yeah,
so
again. So
yeah, exactly. I'm a big believer in buy once, cry once, do it right if you can the first time, and go from there. So like I said, folks, we kind of rambled a little bit on this podcast, but Nick, it's the nice part about Nick is he always asks me questions offline, which is great.
Yeah.
And like I said, he's more of an off-road guy with his big bad Lexus, and I have a feeling I'm gonna start asking him questions on off-roading, because I am getting itchy to do stuff to my big old Bronco, and I don't know jack about off-road stuff, and he does. So I don't know, Nick, we might have to have an off-road show, because I kind of need to be educated on that one. So
yeah. We're up in the Northwest, so we have a lot of mountains and stuff, and we have a lot of people that don't follow. I mean, they're not doing restorations, but they'll buy a brand Security Pro 4Runner, and then they'll go put bumpers and stuff on it before they do any modifications and make it off road. But we can get into that in another episode.
We'll do that. Yeah,
lots of experience, and then I worked at an off-road shop, and so I have a little bit of insight on what's good and what's bad. So it's
good.
It's fun talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, always good. So, ladies and gentlemen, obviously, thanks for tuning in, listening to another episode of the Hot Rod Barbecue Podcast. If you do, or if you're looking for one of those restoration cars, if you're looking for a hot rod that's done, or just a classic vehicle that you can go out and enjoy, obviously, Hemmings has a massive classified section. We got 20,000 plus cars on there at any given time. We have a wonderful auction that you can buy, sell, look. Just go to Hemmings.com, check everything out, and that's it. Nick, thanks again for coming on, and everybody else out there, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening, folks. And again, please subscribe to the Hot Rod Barbecue Podcast. If you're on Spotify, check us out there. Subscribe to it on iTunes. And if you are going to go to YouTube, make sure you go to the Hot Rod Barbecue Podcast and hit that subscribe button, and we'll come to you every week.